With the introduction of YouTube and MMA, over the last couple of decades, there's been a lot of talk around transitioning from sport or traditional based karate through to application or Bunkai based karate. And today, I want to give you my top tips for doing just that. So tip number one on how to transition from sport or traditional karate through to application-based karate. Don't. I want you to think about this analogy. Imagine you're really great at making pizza, and one day someone gives you an amazing chicken vindaloo, and all of a sudden you go, no, you know what, my pizza was crap. No, your pizza wasn't crap. You just now want to learn how to make a chicken vindaloo or a better taco or any other type of food. And so when we do that, we add it on top. But for some reason, there's a stigma doing that in the martial arts. If you add something on top of your existing martial art, you have to drop what there was behind, right? You're no longer part of it. I'm not sure why there is that stigma in the martial arts, but it's absolutely stupid. So, my first tip is don't try to leave what you did behind. There's nothing wrong with the karate you're doing now. There's nothing wrong with the karate you did before. It just suits the individual purpose. And I'm going to get into that in a little while about why the original purpose of that art is so important. So, my tip number one is don't try to leave behind what you're doing now. Simply seek out ways that you can add on top, add flavor, add content to what you're already doing so that it means more to you. But there's nothing wrong with what you've been doing thus far. In fact, if anything, it's given you a great basis to take you to this point. As another analogy, I want you to think of when you go to school. When you get through year 3, you don't go to year 4 and go, oh my God, year 3 was a waste of time. No, that got you to where you are today, and then the next bit is what's going to take you forward into tomorrow. So, what you've done is of great value. Keep hold of that, keep practicing it, keep learning it, but let's just look at how you can add some stuff on top. So my tip number 2 is why. Why do you want to make the change? Why do you want to add on top or transition or whatever you want to call it? Why do you want to make the change from what you're currently doing to the vision that you see for yourself where you want to go? And you need to really understand that in depth. If you believe there's weaknesses in your art, what are those weaknesses? Identify them specifically and why you think they're a weakness, and then seek out the answers to those weaknesses so you can close them off. Make sure you're not just following the trend of, hey, this is the way everyone else is going, but really understand what karate means to you, what it is you want to get out of it, because it might not be self-defense. It might not be, physical application. You may have other reasons for doing those art that are just as valid as self-defense and anything else, no matter what you might hear online. So, be very clear on why you want to make the change. The other thing that's going to do is when you're making that change, it's not easy. It takes time, it takes frustration, and it takes you to criticize what you've done in the past sometimes, and that's really hurtful. So your why, your strong reason why you want to make this change, the goal that you see for yourself, is what's going to carry you through those tough days when you go, you know what? I'm just going to go back to what I'm used to. So make sure you have a clear understanding specifically what it is you're trying to achieve and why you're making that change to your art. So tip number 3, don't just climb out of one box only to climb straight in another. What am I talking about? I'm talking about styles. Styles are someone's viewpoint on what a martial art should be. Don't think that you're going to solve all the problems with your style by jumping into somebody else's style, because every single style has weaknesses. I don't care whether it's what I do or what you do or anybody else. Every style or system has weaknesses. To taste test a whole bunch of different martial arts so that you can make your own deductions about what works well for you. For example, you might think, well, there's no throws in karate, I'm going to go do judo, which is great, but you may not enjoy that. So then I'd recommend that you try getting on the ground with BJJ, or maybe looking at the different dynamic of striking with Muay Thai, or whatever it is that you think is going to give you that more rounded approach. One of my favorite comedians is Billy Connolly, and he said, never ever trust someone who's only got one book. And I believe that's a huge truth in the martial arts. Don't be bound by one person's truth because that's the right truth for them. You have your own truth. Apply critical thinking and do what is right for you. Do your own research. Make that research as wide as possible. and then apply what is useful for you. And to me, that is the real journey between where you were and where you want to be, regardless of what that is. Applying critical thinking with as many different sources as possible. So get out there, explore your local community, jump into every martial art you can, find as many that are as different as possible, and then start to cherry pick the bits that make sense to you. Tip number 4. On Kochishin. It's a maxim that my teacher, Hunchy Patrick McCarthy, talks about all the time, and it means if you want to understand the new, you first need to study the old. You need to know where you've come from before you know where you're going to. And I think that's very true in the martial arts. When you're trying to find the applications to kata, bear in mind that what you're doing is reverse engineering. Be very careful that you're not caught up by contemporary assumption. That is, if we look at the way kata is stylized and things are added or changed today, it may not be what the original pioneers had intended for the kata. And if that's what you're trying to find, it can be very difficult to do when you're looking at today's representation. So my recommendation is this. First of all, study your history. If you understand the history of our art, you understand the history, the anthropology, the personalities that form this art over the period of time, and look specifically between 1908 and 1933. There's some very, very key dates in there that you should keep in mind, and if you've studied your history, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Look in that period and you'll understand how karate changed and why it changed. This will do a couple of things for you. First of all, it'll help you to understand how violence looked back at that time, at the turn of the century. Second thing it'll do is it actually takes away some of your frustration about the way your art is today, because you'll understand that it actually has a very genuine purpose for being the way that it is. It's not a bad thing, it's just that the aims were not perhaps what you were looking for back in that time in Japan. Get as close to the source as you can. If we look at a lot of the prominent people doing kata today, kata applications today, some of those big names, if you trace them back, the majority of them were part of Hunchy Patrick McCarthy's organisation. He was a pioneer of this whole way of thinking of kata. Now, I appreciate that he's not the only one, but yes, I'm biased because I've chosen him as my mentor, as my teacher, and have done so for over a decade now. So I definitely recommend that you get a hold of his works. But the principle remains the same. Get as close to you as you can to those Okinawan sources, or those sources at the point of which your kata started to change, so that you can understand it in as much detail. The final thing I'd mention on this topic is have a look at the older forms of the kata. If we look at Teki Shodan, for example, it's a little bit different from Nai Hanshi, Basadai from Pasai, Kankudai from Kusanku, and so on and so forth. So try and get hold of various sources of the older forms of the kata, and what you'll find is they're different. And if what you're trying to do is get as close to what you think that the applications should have been or were at that time, then the easiest way to do that is to use the older form of the kata, not the modern stylistic representation. The other thing that does is, in some of the modern kata, there's some things that have been added for aesthetics, athleticism, and so forth. They're not particularly effective in self-defense in some cases. So by removing those, it makes it a lot easier to find applications that actually work. Then if you want to use the modern kata, all you can do is then bring that reverse engineering forward a little bit and take the older version, get your application, and then stylize it towards the modern kata application. And that's a lot easier than trying to work it out from the modern kata to start with. If you want to understand kata in depth, if you want to understand our art, you need to look at the source and study the history.